The tension in the cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. Laughter, laced with arrogance, echoed from the corner where Richard Langley and his wealthy friends sat, their expense suits and air of entitlement making them stand out among the more humble patrons. Their conversation had started as idle chatter, but the moment Naomi stepped onto the small stage, it took a sharper, crueler turn. "Look at this one," Richard scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His voice dripped with condescension. "Singing for pocket change? Some people just don't know when to give up." His friends chuckled, casting glances at Naomi as she adjusted the mic, oblivious, or perhaps just used to, the sneers thrown her way. Naomi had spent years chasing a dream that seemed to slip further from her grasp with every rejection, every empty promise. Now she sang in this cafe to survive, not because it was glamorous, but because music was the only thing she had left. Yet tonight, her passion and talent would be put to the test in a way she never expected. Richard leaned forward, his grin widening. "I bet she cracks before the first chorus." His friends laughed again, amused by his cruelty. But what they didn't know was that tonight wouldn't go as Richard planned. This is a story of arrogance, humiliation, and redemption. A tale of how a man who thought his wealth gave him power over others was silenced by the very person he tried to humiliate. Watch until the end, and if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen karma play out this perfectly? The hum of conversation wove through the warm, intimate air of Rosette's Café, a small but charming spot tucked away in the quieter streets of New York. Soft, golden lights hung from the ceiling, casting a mellow glow over the wooden tables where patrons sipped espresso and wine, lost in quiet chatter. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of vanilla, lingering in the air like a familiar embrace. This was a place where dreamers gathered, writers hunched over notebooks, artists sketching absent-mindedly, and musicians, like Naomi, finding solace in melodies that often went unheard outside these four walls. Naomi stood near the modest stage, adjusting the microphone stand with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. The wooden floor beneath her feet creaked slightly as she shifted her weight, her fingers absently tracing the rim of a glass of water resting atop the grand piano beside her. Music had always been her sanctuary, the one thing in life that remained constant, even as everything else wavered. She had spent years chasing an elusive dream, her voice filled with passion and raw emotion, yet the industry had been merciless, slamming door after door in her face. Now she sang here, in this little cafe where no record labels scouted, no grand stages awaited, just people looking for an escape, even if only for a song or two. Tonight, like any other night, she would pour her soul into the music, knowing it might never take her anywhere beyond this space, but singing anyway. It was all she knew. It was all she had left. A sudden burst of laughter shattered the quiet elegance of the cafe, drawing more than a few disapproving glances. Naomi didn't look up right away, but she could feel the shift in the room. The way the warmth dimmed slightly, replaced by an unwelcome presence. The door had swung open moments ago, letting in a gust of cold night air, and with it, a man who did not belong here. Richard Langley stepped inside, exuding an air of wealth and authority that seemed almost too grand for a place as humble as this. Dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, his presence alone demanded attention. But it was not the kind of presence that carried warmth or sincerity. It was the presence of a man who owned boardrooms, who commanded power with a single glance, who saw the world as something to be conquered, not appreciated. His watch gleamed under the cafe's dim lighting, an unsubtle display of extravagance. The air around him carried the faintest scent of expensive cologne, crisp and calculated, like everything about him. Trailing behind him was a small entourage of equally affluent men and women, their laughter bordering on arrogance, their voices too loud for the gentle ambience of Rosette's. They moved with entitlement, as if the very walls should expand to accommodate their presence. As if they were doing this cafe a favor, simply by being here. The waitstaff stiffened at their arrival, exchanging quick glances as they prepared for what was sure to be a difficult group. Richard barely noticed the people around him as he made his way to an unoccupied table near the front, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he surveyed the place. It was laughable, really. A cafe like this, with its mismatched chairs and creaky floorboards, its quiet crowd of nobodies seeking comfort in dim lighting and amateur performances. This was not where men of his stature spent their evenings. He had been dragged here by one of his associates, who had claimed the café had a charming appeal, though Richard suspected the man's idea of charm stemmed from nothing more than an ironic appreciation for the simplicity of the working class. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table's polished surface as his gaze flicked toward the small stage. A grand piano stood at its side, its once gleaming black surface dulled from years of use. A microphone stood waiting for its next performer, but what caught Richard's eye was the woman standing beside it. Naomi. He did not know her name, nor did he particularly care to, but something about her, the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her posture, piqued his interest, if only for a fleeting moment. She was dressed simply, a flowing dark dress that hugged her frame modestly, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had long ago stopped caring about appearances beyond what was necessary for the stage. Yet, there was something about her presence, something unspoken, that made her stand out against the backdrop of this dimly lit café. Richard smirked, the wheels turning in his mind. He had seen performers like her before, aspiring artists with big dreams, clinging desperately to the hope that someone somewhere would notice them. He had encountered them at galas, at private parties, where struggling musicians played for men like him in the hope of earning favor, a record deal, a whispered promise of something more. He had seen the way they stared, longing and hopeful, the way they swallowed their pride and accepted whatever patronizing words were thrown their way. But no one of real importance ever came from places like this. As the chatter in the café settled, the stage lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow over Naomi's face. Richard sipped his drink, amusement flickering in his eyes. He had no doubt she would be competent. She wouldn't have been hired otherwise. But competence was hardly impressive. He had no interest in competence. He wanted something to entertain him, something to break the monotony of the night. And as Naomi stepped up to the microphone, inhaling deeply before her performance began, Richard had no idea that he was about to become the one entertained. Richard leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk curling at the edges of his lips as he watched Naomi take the stage. His gaze swept over her, dissecting every detail with the keen precision of a predator sizing up its prey. Her dress was simple, unremarkable. It lacked the shimmer, the extravagance he was used to seeing on performers who actually mattered. There were no expensive embellishments, no designer labels subtly stitched into the seams, just fabric that draped modestly over her frame, chosen more for comfort than spectacle. His smirk deepened. The way she carried herself, shoulders squared but not in the poised confidence of a star, rather in quiet resilience, only fueled his amusement. He turned to his companions, lifting his glass slightly as though to toast some unspoken joke. "What do we have here?" he mused, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry. Another lost soul clinging to the illusion of talent. His friends chuckled, their laughter polished but empty, the kind that thrived in expensive dining rooms where cruel humor was mistaken for sophistication. Richard took a leisurely sip of his drink, savoring the taste of superiority. This was the kind of entertainment he relished, watching people grasp at success they would never attain, oblivious to the futility of their efforts. His eyes flicked back to Naomi as she adjusted the microphone stand. There was something almost comical about the way she moved, as though she genuinely believed this stage, this moment, meant something. As if it could be the step that changed everything. He had seen it before. The quiet desperation hidden beneath the surface, the foolish optimism that blinded struggling artists from the reality of their insignificance. They all believed they were special, that their talent was enough to rewrite fate. And they were always wrong. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned closer to the table. "Look at her," he drawled, nodding toward Naomi as she tested the mic. "The way she stands, the way she carries herself, she actually thinks this matters." He exhaled, feigning sympathy, before turning to one of the women seated beside him. "Tell me, darling, have you ever heard of her before? A rising star, perhaps? A hidden gem the world has been foolish enough to overlook?" The woman, draped in silk, diamonds glittering at her throat, tilted her head in exaggerated contemplation before laughing softly. No, I can't say I have, she replied, playing along with his mockery. Perhaps she's waiting for someone to discover her. How tragic. Richard let out an exaggerated sigh, drumming his fingers against the table. Ah, the age-old delusion, he mused, that talent alone will lift them from obscurity. His eyes narrowed slightly, his amusement deepening. But if she were worth knowing, wouldn't we have heard of her by now? Another ripple of laughter circled the table, murmured agreements slipping through the air like venom. Richard glanced around the room, pleased to see that some of the other patrons, those who instinctively gravitated toward wealth, hoping to bask in its reflected light, were now watching as well, drawn in by the easy cruelty of it all. That was the nature of power. It dictated the tone of the evening, set the rhythm that others followed. And tonight, he had decided that Naomi was the joke. He turned his attention back to the stage, lifting a brow as she adjusted the mic with steady hands. I do love a good tragedy, he murmured, swirling his drink. Shall we place bets on how long before she stumbles? A forgotten lyric, a missed note, perhaps she'll choke under the weight of it all. His companions smirked, exchanging knowing glances. Or maybe she'll be adequate. One of the men chimed in, amusement dancing in his tone. Not terrible, not great, just forgettable. Richard tapped his chin in mock consideration. Mediocrity would be a kindness, wouldn't it? A quick death rather than a slow, agonizing one. He exhaled dramatically. And yet, here she stands, oblivious to the reality that awaits her. He turned his attention fully to Naomi now, watching as she took one last breath before beginning. There was something undeniably steady about her, a quiet determination in the way she carried herself, but Richard dismissed it as misplaced arrogance. Hope was a foolish thing. He had no doubt she believed in whatever song she was about to perform, in whatever hollow dream she was still clinging to. But belief wasn't enough. Not in this world. He leaned back, arms folding over his chest, waiting for the inevitable. Naomi's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the microphone, her heart pounding beneath the dim glow of the stage lights. She had been here before, standing in front of an audience, bearing her soul through song. But tonight, something was different. The air in the café was heavy, charged with the cruel amusement radiating from Richard's table, his laughter a jagged knife slicing through the intimate atmosphere. She had known ridicule before, had faced dismissive sneers and whispered condescension. But this was louder. This was meant to break her. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and began to sing. A soft, gentle melody, a pop ballad she had written herself. The words had come to her in a moment of quiet vulnerability, a song that spoke of hope, of perseverance, of clinging to dreams even when the world seemed determined to crush them. Her voice was smooth yet emotive, weaving through the air like silk, carrying with it the weight of her struggles and the quiet strength that had kept her standing. For a moment, the café settled into stillness, some of the patrons turning their attention fully to her, drawn in by the quiet sincerity of her performance. But Richard was unimpressed. The smirk never left his face, his fingers tapping impatiently against the rim of his glass as he exchanged knowing glances with his companions. As Naomi reached the first chorus, his voice cut through the delicate melody like a jagged shard of glass. Is this what passes for talent these days? He scoffed, tilting his head back in exaggerated boredom. I've heard better singing from a subway busker. A few people at his table chuckled, emboldened by his mockery, while others shifted uncomfortably. Naomi kept singing, willing herself to push through, to drown out the jeers and laughter that threatened to unravel her. But Richard was not content with mere whispers. He leaned forward, his voice louder now, dripping with condescension. This is the best she could come up with? He said, shaking his head. What a waste of a stage. If you're going to chase an impossible dream, at least try something memorable. His words carried across the café, disrupting the fragile spell Naomi had woven. She saw a few patrons frown, turning toward him with thinly veiled irritation. Someone near the bar muttered something about respecting the performance, but Richard barely spared them a glance. He was enjoying this far too much. Naomi forced herself to focus, pressing on despite the growing noise. But Richard wasn't finished. He let out an exaggerated sigh, swirling the drink in his hand, before leaning back lazily in his chair. Maybe she's singing like this because she knows no one's listening, he mused. And why would they? She's not exactly a headliner. A few more people murmured in discomfort, a waitress shooting Richard a warning glance as she passed. But he didn't care. The more attention he drew, the better. This wasn't just about Naomi. It was about proving a point, that people like her, with no fame, no connections, no real presence in the industry, were nothing but background noise. Naomi clenched her jaw, her voice faltering for just a second before she caught herself. She had seen this kind of arrogance before. Men like Richard who reveled in belittling others just to make themselves feel taller. But she wouldn't stop. Not for him. Not for anyone. She pressed forward, letting her voice rise above the growing hum of conversation, pouring more emotion into every note. She wasn't singing for Richard. She was singing for herself. For every night she had spent doubting, for every rejection she had swallowed, for every moment she had almost given up. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned forward abruptly, knocking his glass against the table with just enough force to draw more eyes toward him. "This is unbearable," he said flatly, his voice loud enough to drown out the music. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I expected more. If she wants to be taken seriously, she should actually prove she has talent, not lull us to sleep with whatever this is." A few guests glared in his direction. One man at a nearby table turned slightly and muttered, "Have some respect." But Richard merely chuckled, amused at the idea that anyone thought they could dictate his behavior. He wasn't here to be polite. He was here to make a point. Naomi, though shaken, kept going. She could see him in her peripheral vision, see the smug tilt of his head, the way he enjoyed making a spectacle of his disdain. Her hands tightened around the microphone, every instinct screaming at her to stop, to walk away before his words chipped away at her resolve. But she refused. She would finish the song, even if he talked through every second of it. She had nearly made it to the bridge when Richard abruptly stood, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor sending a sharp jolt through the café. Conversations hushed, heads turning toward him as he strode toward the stage with the deliberate arrogance of a man who believed he owned the room. Naomi barely had time to react before he was there, his presence imposing, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out and, without hesitation, yanked the microphone from her hands. Silence fell, thick and uncomfortable. Naomi froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at him. The audacity, the sheer gall of it, stole the breath from her lungs. Around the room, murmurs rose, whispers of disbelief rippling through the audience. Richard raised the microphone to his lips, his expression one of exaggerated exasperation. "If you really have talent," he announced, voice dripping with condescension, "then prove it. Not with some forgettable ballad no one cares about, but with something that actually means something. Something real." Naomi felt the weight of every eye in the café pressing down on her, the humiliation thick and suffocating. Richard turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room as he let the tension hang before delivering the final blow. "Sing something nearly impossible," he said, his smirk widening. "Sing 'I Will Always Love You,' and sing it well. Or," he gestured vaguely toward the rest of the café, "give up this ridiculous fantasy and go back to waiting tables." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone let out a stunned chuckle, unsure if this was some elaborate joke or if Richard truly had the audacity to issue such a challenge. Naomi's throat felt tight, the taste of shame threatening to choke her. He had orchestrated this moment perfectly, backed her into a corner in front of everyone, turned her into a spectacle for his own amusement. Richard stepped back, tossing her a smirk as he held out the microphone. "Well?" he taunted. "Show us what you've got." The room was suffocatingly quiet now, all eyes fixed on Naomi. The weight of expectation, of doubt, of her own stubborn pride pressed down on her. She could feel the trap closing around her. If she refused, if she walked away, she would be proving him right. But if she accepted, if she stood her ground, she would be walking into the most brutal test of her life. The moment stretched long and unbearable. Naomi swallowed hard, fingers curling into fists at her sides. And then slowly she reached for the microphone. Naomi tightened her grip on the microphone, her pulse pounding in her ears as she felt the weight of the challenge Richard had thrown at her. It was never about the song. It was about humiliation, about forcing her to bend under his gaze, to wilt in the face of his wealth and arrogance. He had set an impossible standard, daring her to crumble, expecting her to shrink into the background like so many before her. The laughter from his table still echoed in her mind, but as she stood there, something deeper stirred within her. Fear tried to take hold, but it was quickly overtaken by something far stronger: defiance. She took a slow, steady breath, closing her eyes for the briefest moment, allowing herself to push aside the humiliation, the doubt, the weight of years spent struggling in the shadows. This was not about him. This was about every late night spent singing to empty rooms, every rejection that told her she wasn't good enough, every time she had fought to hold on to a dream that the world seemed determined to tear from her hands. The café faded into the background, the murmurs, the clinking glasses, even the smug amusement etched across Richard's face. All of it became nothing more than distant noise. Then, the opening notes of the song filled the room, soft and haunting, a melody so familiar yet so demanding that few dared to attempt it. Naomi lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and let the first note escape her lips. The transformation was instantaneous. The moment her voice resonated through the café, the air itself seemed to shift, thickening with something indescribable, something raw and electric. The first few notes were delicate, a whisper of emotion that crept into every corner of the room, wrapping itself around those who had been mere spectators to Richard's cruelty. But as she moved into the verse, her voice grew, rising with effortless control, carrying each note with a depth that made the very walls seem to tremble. Richard's smirk wavered. The arrogance in his posture faltered as realization settled in, as the sheer richness of Naomi's voice forced its way into his consciousness. He had expected something mediocre, something strained, something that would reaffirm his belief that she was nothing, that she belonged nowhere near a stage. Instead, he was met with a voice so controlled, so filled with an emotion that clutched at the heart, that for the first time that evening he found himself speechless. The room, once filled with his laughter, belonged to Naomi now. The weight of her voice carried through every note, steady and unwavering, laced with a depth of experience, of struggle, of triumph, that no amount of wealth or privilege could ever buy. She was not simply singing. She was breathing life into every lyric, making them her own, shaping them into something greater than the sum of their words. She soared through the chorus, her voice powerful yet delicate, effortless yet commanding, and in that moment, she wasn't just performing. She was proving something. A hush fell over the café, a silence so profound that it felt as though the entire world had paused to listen. A woman near the bar pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes shimmering with something close to disbelief. A man at a corner table exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his drink as if grounding himself. Even the bartender, mid-pour, forgot what she was doing, her hands frozen as she stared at Naomi in stunned silence. Richard's friends, the same ones who had laughed alongside him, who had egged him on, were no longer smirking. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats as the realization of their mistake settled over them like a heavy weight. They had expected a joke, an easy target, a forgettable moment of mockery to add to their evening's entertainment. But they had not expected this. Naomi reached the second chorus, her voice lifting effortlessly, filling every inch of the café with an intensity that sent shivers racing down the spines of those listening. The sheer control in her delivery, the way each note seemed to resonate with something deep and unspoken, left no room for doubt. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning. Richard clenched his jaw, his fingers curling against the table as something unfamiliar and unwelcome twisted inside him. Shame. He had walked into this café with the certainty that he was untouchable, that his wealth and power made him superior to everyone in the room. But as he sat there, forced to listen, forced to feel, he realized just how small he had become in the presence of something far greater than himself. The bridge of the song swelled, Naomi's voice climbing to heights that seemed impossible, her control never faltering, her passion bleeding into every syllable. It was breathtaking, devastating in its beauty, a testament to everything she had endured, to everything she had fought for. She was not simply singing, she was laying herself bare, pouring every ounce of herself into the music, letting the weight of her struggles, her dreams, her defiance fill the room. By the time she reached the final note, the café was utterly still. A collective breath held as if no one dared to break the moment. The last note faded into the silence, soft and lingering, a whisper of something unforgettable, and then the room erupted. Applause thundered through the café, chairs scraping against the floor as people rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. Naomi let out a breath, her chest rising and falling with exertion, her fingers trembling slightly as she lowered the microphone. She had done it. She had taken his challenge and turned it into her victory. Richard remained seated, his hands motionless, his face pale. Around him, his friends, the very people who had once been his audience in cruelty, were now among those cheering the loudest. His world had shifted, his dominance shattered, and for the first time in a very long time, he had no words. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. There was no malice there, no arrogance, no need for revenge. Only quiet, unwavering strength. And that, Richard realized, was what made his loss so much greater. Because she hadn't just won, she had never needed to compete with him in the first place. Naomi stood on the stage, her breathing still uneven as the final note of her song faded into the air, dissolving into the thick, electrified silence that had settled over the café. For a moment, there was nothing. No clinking of glasses, no whispered conversations, no forced laughter from Richard and his circle of self-important guests. The entire room seemed to hover on the precipice of something unspoken, as if everyone present was grasping for the right way to respond to what they had just witnessed. And then, like a tidal wave crashing against the shore, the silence broke. Applause erupted from every corner of the café, a sound so overwhelming, so immediate, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was not polite clapping, not the obligatory appreciation for yet another lounge singer offering background noise to an evening out. It was raw, uninhibited admiration. A woman near the bar stood up first, her hands coming together in an almost frantic rhythm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A man at a nearby table followed, whistling through his fingers as he joined in the applause. Then another, and another, until the entire café was on its feet, cheering, clapping, voices rising in excitement, their appreciation for Naomi's talent spilling over like a flood breaking through a dam. Naomi stood motionless in the center of it all, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the microphone, absorbing the moment with an almost disbelieving gaze. She had sung countless times before, had poured her heart and soul into every performance, but never had she felt something quite like this. This was not just approval, it was validation, it was recognition. It was a room full of people who, just minutes ago, had barely looked her way, now seeing her for what she was, a force of nature, an artist, someone whose voice could not be dismissed or belittled. But no reaction was more telling than that of Richard Langley. The man who had orchestrated this moment with the sole purpose of humiliating her, now sat frozen in his chair, his body rigid, his once smug expression contorted into something unrecognizable. The confidence that had dripped from every word he spoke earlier had drained from his face, leaving him exposed, stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He was caught in the throes of something he could not name, a humiliation far worse than any he had intended to inflict on Naomi. His friends, once his loyal enablers, were no longer laughing. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats, unsure whether to continue aligning themselves with Richard or to give in to the infectious energy of the room. Some had already made their choice. One man, seated directly across from Richard, turned away from him entirely, clapping with enthusiasm. A woman beside him, who had spent the evening indulging Richard's mockery with playful giggles, now had her arms crossed, her gaze cool and appraising as she observed Richard's growing discomfort. Naomi's victory was undeniable. The applause continued, rolling through the café like waves, unrelenting in its force. Richard, for all his wealth and status, could do nothing but sit there, utterly powerless against the force of what had just happened. His hands clenched against the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. A deep flush had crept up his neck, staining his face a shade of crimson that was impossible to miss. He was trapped, A man accustomed to wielding control, now at the mercy of a room that no longer cared for his presence. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. The game had shifted, the power dynamics reversed. He had set the stage for Naomi's failure, had placed every obstacle in her path, believing that she would stumble, that she would fold beneath the pressure and prove herself unworthy. Instead, she had risen, had taken the moment he had created for her downfall and transformed it into something triumphant. And worst of all, he had been the one to give her the opportunity to do so. His name had always carried weight, had always been synonymous with success and influence. But in this moment, none of it mattered. No amount of money, no number of connections could erase what had just transpired. He had underestimated Naomi, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. The applause finally began to subside, though the energy in the room remained electric, a lingering charge that refused to dissipate. Naomi met Richard's gaze then, her expression unreadable. There was no gloating, no smug satisfaction, only quiet certainty. A woman who had nothing to prove but had proven everything nonetheless. Richard wanted to look away, wanted to retreat into the shadows of his own making, but he couldn't. He was held captive by the weight of his own disgrace, forced to sit in the very seat he had prepared for Naomi. The cafe owner stepped forward then, offering Naomi a smile filled with pride before turning to the room. "Now that was a performance," he declared, and another wave of cheers rippled through the crowd. And then came the final, crushing blow. From a table near the back, a man who had been silent throughout the evening finally stood. He was older, distinguished, his tailored suit speaking of a quiet affluence, his sharp eyes assessing. He stepped forward, weaving through the crowd until he was near the stage, offering Naomi an approving nod. Then, in a voice that carried across the hushed room, he spoke. "I represent the New York Music Initiative," he said simply. "I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." A murmur spread through the cafe, excitement sparking in the air like a live wire. Naomi's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the microphone as realization dawned. This moment was something greater than she had ever dared to imagine. Richard, meanwhile, finally found his voice, though it was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're kidding me," he muttered, but no one was listening. His moment of dominance had passed, his laughter had died. Naomi had won. Richard, for the first time in his life, had become irrelevant. Naomi stood frozen on the stage, her breath catching in her throat as the applause roared through the cafe like a storm that refused to die down. Every face in the room seemed to shine with admiration, their expressions filled with awe and respect. She had never experienced a moment like this before. Never had she felt so seen, so validated. Her entire life had been spent chasing this very feeling. Yet now that it was here, it felt almost too overwhelming to believe. And then, from amidst the sea of clapping hands and murmured excitement, a man rose to his feet. The shift in the room was immediate. The applause began to quiet, and the murmurs grew hushed as heads turned toward him. He wasn't just another spectator caught in the wave of Naomi's triumph. His presence carried a weight that demanded attention. He was tall, dressed in a sleek black suit that seemed effortlessly sophisticated. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, his sharp eyes scanning Naomi with a look that was both analytical and intrigued. The cafe, which had moments ago been a cacophony of voices and movement, now felt charged with an entirely new kind of anticipation. "Michael Carter." Even before he spoke, whispers spread like wildfire through the cafe. Some gasped. Others nudged their companions, recognizing him instantly. Naomi, standing motionless, barely processed the name at first, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the moment. She had read about Michael Carter in music industry magazines, had seen his name attached to some of the most successful artists of the decade. He was a legend in the business, a producer known for transforming unknown talents into icons. The fact that he was here, in this tiny cafe, was almost unbelievable. With measured steps, he moved toward the stage, each movement deliberate, his gaze never leaving Naomi. She swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming wildly in her ears. Every part of her told her this was impossible. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like her. Struggling musicians didn't just get discovered in dingy little cafes after being humiliated by arrogant businessmen. And yet, as Michael Carter reached into his pocket and produced a sleek, embossed business card, reality settled in with a force that nearly stole her breath. He extended the card toward her, his voice smooth and confident when he finally spoke. "You have something special, Naomi. I haven't been this moved by performance in a long time." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise. "I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. If you're ready to take your talent beyond this cafe, we should talk." Naomi stared at the card, barely daring to reach for it. Her fingers trembled as she finally took it, the weight of it so much more than just paper. It was possibility. It was a door she had been banging on for years, finally opening. She forced herself to breathe, to steady the whirlwind of emotions surging through her chest. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then don't say anything yet. Think about it. Call me when you're ready." With that, he nodded, turning slightly as if to leave. But before he could fully step away, another voice cut through the lingering hush in the cafe. "This is ridiculous," Richard scoffed, his face still red with humiliation. The same man who had tried to reduce her to nothing now sat seething in his chair, watching as she was offered everything he believed she could never have. "She's just some cafe singer. You really think she has what it takes?" Michael turned his head slightly, his expression unbothered, almost amused. "I know talent when I see it," he said simply, "and she has it." The words landed like a final nail in Richard's coffin. Whatever pride he had left, whatever hold he had once thought he had on the night, it crumbled completely in that moment. The laughter that had once filled his voice was gone, replaced by nothing but bitter silence. He had tried to turn Naomi into a joke, had expected her to fail, but now, as he sat there watching her receive an opportunity that most could only dream of, he was the one left powerless. Naomi, still clutching the business card, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned toward the audience, toward the faces still beaming at her, and something in her chest shifted. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was merely surviving. She felt like she was stepping into the life she was meant to live. As Michael Carter exited the cafe, leaving behind an air of promise, Naomi knew that her world had changed forever. The struggles, the countless nights of doubt, the moments of wondering if she would ever make it, it had all led to this. And as she looked down at the card in her hand, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. The cafe was still buzzing with the echoes of Naomi's breathtaking performance. Applause and cheers filled the space, lingering in the air like a victorious anthem. Every eye in the room shone with admiration. Every whisper carried the same awestruck tone. But amidst the celebration, Richard sat frozen in his chair, the arrogance he once wore like armor now shattered into irreparable fragments. His carefully curated world of privilege and self-importance had just crumbled in front of a crowd he once controlled. He had intended to humiliate Naomi, to reduce her to nothing more than a passing joke, but instead, he had become the joke himself. The power had shifted, slipping through his fingers as Naomi had commanded the stage, proving her worth with every flawless note, every raw emotion poured into the song. Whispers rippled through the cafe, growing louder as people stole glances at Richard. Some muttered in amusement, others in open disdain. A few of his so-called friends exchanged glances, their smirks fading as they quietly stepped away, as if to distance themselves from the man who had just been publicly stripped of his superiority. One by one, they left his side, leaving him isolated in his shame. Richard clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. His jaw tightened as he fought the rage brewing inside him, but there was nowhere to direct it. He wanted to sneer, to throw out another insult, but what could he possibly say? He had lost. Not just the challenge, but his credibility, his dominance, his ability to manipulate a situation to his advantage. He had been silenced by the very woman he had tried to belittle. Naomi, on the other hand, stood tall, a quiet confidence radiating from her. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to meet his eyes with triumph. Her victory was already absolute. The cafe had chosen a side, and it wasn't his. She had not only won their respect, but she had also secured something far greater, a future. As Richard rose from his chair, every movement felt like trudging through thick, suffocating humiliation. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment hanging in the air. He straightened his suit, trying to regain some semblance of dignity, but it was a futile attempt. He was already marked by the night, forever remembered as the man who tried to break a woman with his words, only to be broken by her talent. He made his way toward the door, shoulders tense, mind racing. The air outside was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the fire of embarrassment burning within him. This night would follow him. The story would spread beyond these walls, seeping into the upper echelons of society where his reputation once stood untarnished. He had orchestrated Naomi's humiliation, yet in a cruel twist of fate, he had scripted his own downfall instead. And Naomi? She had only just begun her rise. Naomi stepped out into the cool night air, the lingering energy of the performance still crackling in her veins. The neon sign above the café flickered softly, its glow reflecting in the puddles on the pavement. For the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed deeply, letting the night wrap around her like an embrace. The weight she had carried for so long, the endless rejections, the quiet doubts, the whispered judgments, had begun to lift. She had not only proven her worth, but she had done so on her own terms. Inside, the echoes of her song still hummed in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, some still reveling in the sheer power of her voice, others exchanging knowing glances as they replayed the stunned expression on Richard's face. His arrogance had shattered in the wake of her performance, and now he sat alone, his once loyal entourage nowhere in sight. The smirk that had curled his lips in mockery had long since vanished, replaced by a taut silence. He had arrived at the café believing that his wealth and status entitled him to belittle others, to toy with lives for his own amusement. But tonight he had been confronted with a force he could neither buy nor control: raw, undeniable talent. Naomi's fingers tightened around the card still clutched in her palm. Michael Carter's name was embossed in gold, a tangible promise of something she had chased her entire life. The renowned producer had approached her before she left, his eyes alight with genuine admiration. He spoke of opportunity, of doors flung open, of the world finally seeing her as she truly was, a star waiting to rise. Yet even as excitement coiled in her chest, she remained grounded, her heart steady. This was not a fluke, not some stroke of luck handed to her by fate. She had earned this moment through years of resilience, and she would continue to fight for every step forward. Behind her the café door swung open, and a few stragglers emerged, their voices carrying snippets of conversation. She caught the tail end of a remark, someone marveling at the poetic justice of the night, another chuckling at how Richard had recoiled into silence, a man unaccustomed to being bested. Naomi didn't turn to look at him again. There was no need. He was already fading into the background, his significance dwindling like a forgotten shadow. Whatever humiliation he felt tonight was his own to bear, a consequence of his own arrogance. She had nothing left to prove to him or anyone else who had ever doubted her. She started walking, each step lighter than the last. The city stretched before her, its streets alive with possibility. The air carried the scent of rain, the promise of renewal, of change. Naomi smiled to herself. This was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. She had faced the fire and walked through it unscathed. She had stood before those who wished to see her fail and instead made them listen. And as she moved forward, she carried with her the truth that no amount of wealth or power could silence a voice meant to be heard. In the end, Richard had walked away with nothing but his own disgrace, while Naomi had walked away with everything. And that was justice.